getting into kind of that next absolutely crucial step. So we've gone through the wear time, so now we are quite confident that the data we are now going to be scoring is valid data. This is data pulled from where they actually had the monitor on, and so we can start playing and looking at our outcomes. So from now on, we're going to be talking about this third tab here in the ActiveLife titled Scoring. And instead of going from top to bottom, I'm going to kind of stay with the theme of wear time validation because there's some other filters here that are related to wear time. So I'm just going to go to those first, and then we will be done talking about wear time forever, and then we'll only be talking about energy expenditure and cut points and intensity, if that makes sense. So bear with me because you have no choice. So as I mentioned, at the bottom you've got these kind of filters, which again are all optional, but allow you to get more, a better handle on the data and make more critical decisions about what data is classified as wear or non-wear. And this is where we can pull in those subject log diaries that I referred to, that seems like 3 hours ago. And you can pull those in here to have a second layer of eyes based on patient-reported times that they had the monitors on. You also have an option down here called global date and time filters. And that's a scenario where, for example, say I told patients I only want to monitor, I'm only interested in weekend activity. I'm only interested in weekend warriors, for example. So this is where I could come in and set a time filter to say, only look at the data collected from Saturday morning at 6 a.m. to Sunday night at 11. And so regardless of what other days of data they have in there, it will only score that span of time. And we'll go through some examples of those as well. So here's an example of what a subject log diary would look like if you're interested in collecting these data. They do improve the speed of processing if you have this additional level of detail to provide. And you do provide them per individual. So these are linked to each individual file. So they're linked based on study ID, and then you provide data for each of the days of wear. There's actually been some exciting work coming out to say that just knowing the days that they wore it, regardless of the time, is in itself enough to let us really accurately capture days of wear and non-wear. But for here, I'll give you kind of the detailed look if you ever decide to do that. So you have to generate a log diary, which ActiveLife has a specific template you have to use and download. That is, again, one of these CSV, looks like an Excel file type of format. And then you can import it in ActiveLife down here with the import function. And again, it matches on subject name. So if you go ahead and click that kind of question mark, for example, you'll have this thing pop up that says open log diary. This is a screenshot of mine, but you can go ahead. So this is where you can actually open the log diary that you've created and import it into the software. We're not there yet, right? We haven't created one, but they give you the template here for you to use. And it has to follow this format. So it has to have these columns in its subject name, the date that they put it on, time on, off date, off time. This category F they actually don't use anymore. It's still in the template, but it's not utilized at all, so I always just go ahead and delete it. But each person can have multiple rows of data, right? So you could have a period where they put it on at 8 a.m. on November 4th, they take it off at 11 a.m. on November 4th, they put it back on at 2 p.m. November 4th. So you could have multiple rows of data for each individual person. And I do try to provide an example of that here. So again, just for your legacy files, if you go back and you forget that I said category F is not needed, here it is in the slides for perpetuity. And here is an example of creating that kind of detailed log for someone who has multiple days or multiple bouts of wear in a specific day. And so again, this 159710 has about, 8 or so different bouts of wear. So this is someone either who naps a lot or who swims a lot, takes a lot of showers. I'm not sure, but these are all times where they took it on and off. So you can see how this could be resource heavy on the back end as well, not only for the person to fill out, but then for you to enter manually. And again, it has to follow this specific format. But, okay, say you've created that, you've got a nice robust selection of files, we would go ahead and tell ActiveLife, okay, I actually have some really handy participant data on where. And so I would go in here, click Use Subject Diaries, and then go to the import, and I would have some files to add. And I don't know if I have one saved here, but there is one in Dukebox, which is an example as well. But what I wanted to show you is that when you do import them, you have this column in the score. Oh, hold up, sorry. One thing I forgot to mention is getting all of your files from the Where Time to the Scoring tab. So if you bear with me and go back to Where Time, where we have all of our 12 files checked, we already calculated them. If we click Score, it automatically pre-populates them and takes them into the next step, which is great. So you don't have to go back and manually enter them again. So if you did the Use Subject Log Diaries, you imported them, you'll have this column called Log Diary. And you'll see that it will show you which files have a log diary associated with them. So that's, again, really handy to have as well. Okay. So a couple notes to words of caution or things to consider about log diaries. Is that your files have to be in the scoring tab before you can load a diary, so it has to have a file to link it to. They can only be deleted going through this scoring tab. So if you click View Log Diary, delete all entries. Do you want to delete all entries? Yes. Okay, and that's the only way you can get rid of your diaries. If you didn't want to remove them, but you just didn't want to include them in analyses, you could just unclick the box and do it that way as well. And the only other thing is that you can't adjust any of those values in the software. You have to go back to your Excel template, change everything there, reload it and import it, and then it will overwrite what you had there before. Yes, Shane?
Now, what's the purpose of loading your own subject log diary?
It's just to provide another layer of screening for wear time. So we have these algorithms like the Choi or the Troiano, but we realize that those still are calculated and can be a little crude. So this provides one more level of specificity using this patient-reported wear time diary.
Well, in reality, people may not have the time or effort to write down, right? So.
Yes. So actually, there are very few people who actually return this reliably. Yeah. And so that's why sometimes I'll load the ones that I have, but then I also want to be consistent in how I treat the files, so I'll just deactivate them when I do my analysis. And then you could also compare within individuals what happens when I use the diary versus when I not. Our values drastically different, and that's another cautionary tale as well. But yeah, you're right. It's not imperfect. It's imperfect, but it's just another layer. Yeah.
I know we're talking about patients, wear time, but recording their wear time activity. But another instance where it did help was, for instance, when we collected the monitors from the patients, the clinical research coordinator did walk with the monitor to download then the monitor. So it was still actively collecting data, but by having a log of when that research coordinator actually picked up the monitor and said this is the time that the patient stopped wearing it, then we were able to have Catherine delete everything else that was extra information. So that's how it is helpful to have.
That's right. It's another check. And again, that's anticipating that someone walks it with it for 10 hours the next day, it would be kicked out. But mail-based protocols, this is really helpful to have. Again, that it's not the postal worker carrying around the envelope, taking it back to your lab, it's actually a patient. And again, I'm really excited by the work coming out that we don't even need this hour on off just the day to really integrate it. I just have a few notes here about the global date and time because it's very infrequent that I have folks who are interested in doing this type of work. But again, it's really able to isolate specific days or specific times that you're interested in. So if you're interested in just morning activity levels versus evening, this is the way to do it. And it forces your data scoring tool to generate results for for various time periods. You could do multiple, you could do one. But again, that filter identifies the data that you want to use, not the ones you're excluding. It's the actual data that you want it to analyze. So if we're going to do a little hands-on, if you get back into the scoring tab of ActiveLife and you click on the button with add new date and time filter under the global date and time. And I want you to create a mornings filter for weekends from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. And then we'll create another one for the afternoons. So we add a new date and time, come up with some name that hopefully reflects kind of the intuitive information. So I might do weekend mornings. Again, you want to specify the days that you want it to include for analysis. So I'm only interested in weekends. And then I think I said 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. So I would set that down here. And accept. And you'll see that's checked here, and so this would apply to every single file in that scoring tab. And you could do the same thing again if you were interested in another discrete period of time. If it's weekend evenings, Saturday mornings, again, that option is available to you. But again, it's all optional. Again, rarely use it. The most common times that I see it is if we want to really specify in the absence of wear diaries, or when we have a lot of patients who wore it for a 24-hour cycle instead of only during waking time. I might apply a filter that says only from 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. to 11 p.m. And then anything after that, in between that window, is not included on here. Again, that takes a lot of consideration before you apply something like that, but it is possible, and some people do. Oh yes, the other important piece to pick here is that all of these stick around even after you close the software. So you finish your analyses, you close it, you come back a week later, you open it. If you don't pay attention, this is going to still be checked. So if you're running a different data file that does not have those parameters, you just need to be conscious of that it does hang around as well. But you'll see that when you run your analysis, and you'll see only 4 hours of wear time as well. Okay, so scoring. Going back from when I mentioned kind of bringing these over, if we went back to the wear time and we click score, it automatically pre-populates the scoring much faster. And so now we're going to get into that kind of top part of the software here, which is all about deciding what algorithms we're going to choose to identify the various outputs that we said we were interested in at the start. So I mentioned at the beginning we have 6 optional parameters. All of these are available to you. You can choose 1 or 2, but again, you really want to be realistic about the scope here and avoid the kitchen sink approach to just, I want everything and anything, and then you only use a small portion of that. So steps, there's no algorithm for steps. So if you didn't check any of these boxes on the top left, you would still get steps. It's everything else in this list that you need to identify population-specific and location-specific algorithms to calculate these variables. And each parameter, energy expenditure, METs, intensity, all have their own algorithms that we need to consider. So this is where the meat of the work goes into, kind of talking with people about who did you collect this in, where did you monitor, what are you interested in, and what is out there in the literature that is relevant to your population. All right, I already talked about steps. In addition, if you don't check any algorithms, you'll get the counts per minute for each of the 3 axes, you'll get the vector magnitude counts, you'll get the time that the monitor was worn, and the number of valid days that you have. So that's the bare minimum data set that you'll get. Now, energy expenditure and METs. These are those studies that I referred to that are kind of the product of these regression equation generating type of scientific work. And this requires a lot of intensive field study where they're trying to map on this unit of counts per minute onto these other metrics of kilocalories, METs, energy expenditure, basically VO2. And so the way we do this work is that we have, well, the most common way is that we have someone wear this indirect calorimetry system. So something like what these folks are wearing here, it collects all of your expired gases. And then we have folks do a variety of different activities, and we correlate it and look at it in respect to the counts per minute registered on the actigraph. So we have studies in all different types of ages, populations. We have lifestyle activities, we have treadmill running. People have really tried to cover the spectrum here. But you can imagine though how tedious and specific this work is, right? So if you have a Parkinson's population and you recruit people who are 20 to 40, it's such a specific population, it really only applies to that age group. Can you extrapolate it reliably to a 70 and 80-year-old person with Parkinson's? Or is that the best case scenario versus using an algorithm that was validated on 20 to 30-year-old healthy folks? So these are the kind of trade-offs that we're going to be talking a lot about in these next couple of steps. Kenny?
I guess you kind of answered my question. So I guess if you're making an argument in a manuscript, like would most studies look to validate their own patients with like a separate assessment of VO2 to validate that versus it, or you know, is it really just like how much criticism will it receive if you say, all right, well they burned 600 calories, you know,
Yes,
3 hours
yes. Yeah, that's why I think, one, you don't see a lot of papers who are focusing on these outcomes in only. They're usually looking at the full activity profile. But two, the field generally recognizes that these studies are lacking. And so providing that, again, obligatory statement in your discussion section about the limitations of the way we process this data is realistic. But again, it's also exciting about why hopefully we're moving away from even just relying on these regression equations and going into more machine learning, the data speaking to us and telling us what's going on, as opposed to imposing these algorithms to interpret relative to counts. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like there's a lot of like drawback now on like things like apps like MyFitnessPal, things like that import like data in from, let's say, your Fitbit, and they say someone's workout like might be 500 calories in their workout, and there's really nothing to justify that, and then people take that out of their daily calories or whatever. But it's a big issue now.
It is, and it's funny how that hit late on commercial devices. Like people took commercial devices almost at their face value, and the validation work in those is really lacking relative to, again, this is a relatively young field as well, last 20 years, but still. There are issues with all monitors. Again, that's a whole different workshop. But we have a variety of cut points, again, taking those counts per minute, identifying these cut points to then map onto energy expenditure and METs. And again, we've done them in whole different populations, children, older adults, Parkinson's again. But most of them have been done using just the waist or the hip wear location. Which again is another consideration, that we can't just extrapolate those, or that people are doing a lot of work to try to figure out how do we interpret or scale those for the wrist device, since that's by and large where everyone is going to do that. So if we go into your ActiLife, and we are going to do energy expenditure first, if you click the drop down box, you'll see we have 5 options here. A lot of them have Friedson in there. That's Patty Friedson out of University of Massachusetts. She was kind of the godmother of accelerometry and did a lot of the initial, and continues to do almost all of the work and validation and algorithm development, and also now leading this field of machine learning to really look at the raw data from accelerometers. So everything that basically wasn't ActiLife created, which is what this Williams work energy theorem is all different takes on her iterative work. So of the 5 algorithms here, I've just described really briefly where they came from, who they were developed in, and what kind of parameters apply to them. And I've kind of indicated in red what kind of the critical values. So the first thing to notice is whether they use all 3 axes, which again, all monitors now have. Back in the early 90s, late 90s, they were only uniaxial accelerometers. So they didn't have the 3 planes of analysis. Again, so we're really trying to get away from that. We're trying to make use of the 3 axes to develop. The other issue that we'll see with Dr. Friedson's early work is that she had these parameters of, okay, we can reliably extrapolate or estimate kilocalories from counts per minute, but only if people have register at least 1,950 counts per minute. So there's this lower threshold that has to be met. So then realizing the limitation on that, they kind of combine the two, so this work energy, which is just a complete physics equation, with her work in humans, and kind of combining the two, that if it's above 1951, we use this theorem, if it's below, we use this theorem. Some limitations to that, again, still just using the one axis. So then we have this kind of latest iteration of equations, which is, again, just using the vector magnitude, so all three, but again, still has this lower threshold cut point of 2,453 counts per minute. And then again, she has this combination with that work energy theorem to meet us in the middle here. So to look at this, I wanted to, if you could just pull out these IDs here, 948655, 733464, 562365, and 251941. Does everyone also have these unchecked and moving? Can't tell if these are defaults or not, but basically we're just gonna do the bare bones analysis where it just gives us the very basic. Okay, so if we look at the values for these folks, so these are our 60, 70, our 60, 70, and 80-year-olds. And we see a threshold of 1951 counts per minute. So we scroll over. So if you look under axis 1, counts per minute, so that's the vertical axis. And that's what she's using for these criteria for the uniaxial. So for this one, they would be required to have at least 1,951. And you'll see our folks are barely getting over 200. So this really underestimate the kilocalorie expenditure for our older adults. So then you might be like, okay, well, if we use the combination then that has vector magnitude as well, so then we would scroll over to the vector magnitude counts per minute. And here they're specifying at least 2,400. Again, we're about a fifth of that in our older adults. So that nixes that one as well. So that leaves us with 3 of the remaining energy expenditure equations. And by and large, folks have embraced this last one, which is a combination of using the 3 axes, but then also that work energy theorem. Again, I'm not crossing off any of these other ones for a couple of reasons. One, because a lot of population-based studies did their seminal work using these criteria. So once again, if you do want to make any comparisons, you want to analyze your data in the same way. But again, I would recommend maybe doing that first, but then also having a complementary analysis that uses updated best practices for determining that. Okay, so if we've selected that, energy expenditure, the Friedson VM3 combination by and large becomes our go-to for older adults. And so I went ahead and did this, so we wouldn't have to do this in real time, but I went ahead and ran those 5 algorithms separately, taking note of the activity kcals, so that unit of analysis. And so here are the 4 IDs for the 70 and 80-year-olds, and here are the various equations. And if you look again just within person, you start to see much greater values when you get into these combination theorems than you do either of them alone. And so these ones really tend to underestimate kcals in older adults. And these 3, there's not a huge difference across the 3. But again, you'll see that this tends to give older adults the most credit, but still knowing that this is likely an underestimate of the kcals that older adults are spending. So other considerations, any questions about that? Okay. So if you want to go ahead and do that with me then, we do energy expenditure, Fritzen vector magnitude 3, combination 2011, and you click calculate. You can do it for all, actually. And again, I'm not going to go into these column details yet until the end, but we have a lot of information here about all of these variables. So you have a summative value, you have the per axis energy expenditure, and then you finish with the days of valid wear time and the total time that it was worn. So, as I mentioned before, there's some really basic information you have. Energy expenditure is one of those where we absolutely have to have body weight. So you need to make sure that that gets input before this stage. You also need to be mindful of where the device is placed. So as I mentioned, these are all waist-worn algorithms, but they have been working on developing scaling techniques to aggregate or scale up, considering that activity counts on the wrist are exponentially larger than those on the waist, so trying to make them compatible. But again, those validation studies are still being done, which needs to be considered. There are also no algorithms or equations, as we just looked at, for older adults. So they're all for middle-aged, healthy adults. And so all of them will kind of overestimate kilocalories in older adults because of the lower threshold. So here's an example from a paper that we did here at Duke looking at older adults with chronic disease, recognizing that again, as we age, as chronic disease happens, that the intensity of activities becomes higher. But again, this is just kilocalorie expenditure. So as we age, we also tend to lose lean mass. So the threshold here is, and the white dots here is the Fritzen equation. We have another kind of standard equation, which is Schwartz. And then this is what we actually measured, this slope of this line here, in the actual older adults. And you'll see that both the Schwartz and the Fritzen estimated much higher levels of kcals in energy expenditure than our older adults for the same threshold of activity. So it's, again, just something to be mindful of, and there are some more studies looking at this as well. Any questions about energy expenditure? Okay. So you'll see here, energy expenditure, you cannot choose something else. It's not like you can say, okay, well that paper that I just looked at here says actually I should be using different cut points or different algorithms. We can't, I guess, we can't alter Actilife's algorithms. We have to choose what's pre-populated there. Actilife has been responsive to requests to include other algorithms for people as they become available, but again, that's really out of your control versus some other outcomes that we'll talk about. So METS, again, we have some similar drawbacks or limitations to this energy expenditure or cost of activities, and we have a lot more algorithms to choose from. So if you look under METS, you'll see we have about 10 or 11 algorithms that have been developed to look at developing regression equations using activity counts per minute from the accelerometer and extrapolating METS of activities. And so I'm not going to go over all of these in detail, but again, just for your reference, I provide some summative information that you should know about each of them. And I'm only focusing on the adults here as well, because there are some children. But you'll see that they differ both by the activity mode. So some of these specify walking at 3 different speeds on a treadmill. Some specify playing golf, indoor and outdoor activities, recreation and conditioning, jogging on an indoor track. So the type of activity that these folks are using for their validation studies differs. The pace and the intensity differs as well. So is it fast walking? Is it jogging? Is it leisurely walking? And then also the setting. Is it in the lab or is it in free living conditions? And all of these are things that I take into consideration when I'm trying to figure out what is the best fit for who you're measuring, where you're doing it, and what you want to know. The other thing to take away is obviously, so actually some of these don't report the age, but the age tends to be middle-aged adults. That's like the default and usually healthy. And so again, it's kind of trying to pick what fits your data best. All of these algorithms, though, do adhere to kind of the standard definitions of what a MET is. So anything less than 3 METs is considered light intensity, moderate 3 to 6, and above 6 is vigorous intensity. And the underlying premise that becomes an issue when we're working with older adults is that in the scientific literature, it's generally understood and assessed that 1 MET at rest, what you're doing at rest, is relatively equivalent to 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So your resting metabolic rate. And we find that actually in older adults, as many of us probably know, that the resting metabolic rate is actually much lower because, again, of that loss of lean mass and increase in fat mass. So if your denominator in and of itself is different, then all of these values, again, are going to be underestimating. The other issue is that the relationship between counts per minute and METs is really robust and linear. It's beautiful in younger adults and healthy adults. And as you can imagine with almost everything else we study, once you get into the aging population and chronic disease, the relationship is not linear. It's everything else. It's all over the place. And so our relationship is much less robust. So in younger adults or middle-aged adults, it's about 0.8 relationship between increasing activity counts and increasing MET values. In older adults, it's only about correlation of 0.6. So we lose a lot of the power there to predict and explain MET values in older adults. So again, unfortunately, I have the same bullet point that there are no algorithms or equations derived specifically for older adults at this point, so all of them will underestimate. So again, it's just important to know what the direction of that bias is, and it's going to be an underestimate in the MET values. And here I've presented the chart that was in that paper that had the regression equation. So here we had subjects doing treadmill walking at 4 different speeds or 5 different speeds, and then self-paced walking in the hallway. We measured the counts per minute using the accelerometer on the waist. We measured oxygen consumption with the calorimeter, and then we had the metabolic data from the COSMED, and then also the MET values from the COSMED. This last column here, though, is really what's the interesting part, and this is what is considered standard. So that's the values that all of the other studies in younger, healthy, middle-aged adults would expect the intensity or the metabolic cost of these activities to be. So for example, walking at 1.5 miles per hour, and this patient population measured it to be about 3.9 METs, which is already in the moderate intensity range. So nothing actually that we did fell in light. So we overshot the mark there. But that would be classified as light intensity if you were used to standardized metrics. And same thing with kilocalories and all of that. So there's some, again, interesting work to be done, but again, kind of highlights the impetus and why we're all so excited to maybe be leaving the counts per minute criteria to the wayside and going into these more kind of rich analytic procedures of looking at the actual data instead of these calculated metrics. Okay, so if we're going to try to select a METS algorithm, I've taken a first pass at what we would cut. First thing is, treadmill exercise. Most of us are not monitoring people in the lab. We're capturing free living activities. So I took out anything that was strictly lab-based. I also took out any algorithms that had a different epoch length that we would likely not be using. Also took out based on kind of characteristics if they were young, and again, basically those kind of values, which leaves us with 3 of those 11 that might be considered for your algorithm. The Friedson, again, this is her original equation. It's going to provide you the lowest values for MET, so it's really the most egregious in terms of underestimating MET values with activity for older adults. The Hendelman article is a good alternative, but again, they didn't do any light intensity activities, so again, the replicability and reference point, it seems limited. So we find that we typically tend to use the Schwartz algorithm for our work with older adults to give us the most generous equation or calculation of METs. Same thing here with about worn on wrist. The other interesting thing about METs is that they want gender. They need gender to do these calculations. So in addition to the weight and the body location, we need gender. And then I'm not going to go into all these, but these are things that we either are or are not aware of, either from a physical physics standpoint or a biological standpoint, that would impact energy expenditure specific to accelerometry and these equations. So again, these are all just things we need to be mindful of if we're going to stake our flag in the METS algorithm camp. But most of us are looking at this option for output, and that's this cut points and activity intensity. So trying to classify how much time people are spending in sedentary, light, moderate, all of the above. So this will break out the proportion of time based again on those epochs. And then we have, again, these same types of studies looking at counts per minute measured on the monitor and trying to extrapolate then where does that fall in the activity intensity wheel. And if you click on in the ActiveLife software and you click the down box, you'll see here we've got a ton of options. A lot of them though are in children, so actually we lose quite a bit of the options once we start looking for adults or older adults. But what's really nice, this is the only option available that you have to enter your own. So if you find a study, for example, that is in older HIV patients in the South, and they've done this calibration study, and you're like, these are the ones I want to use. I don't want to use the NHANES. I want to go ahead and impute my own. You can add this new cut point set and define your own thresholds. So this is where we're seeing a lot of people go if you have a special population that some of this work has been done. Unfortunately, that's not the norm. Most of us have special populations but don't have specific cut points. So again, it's just trying to find what is the best fit. The other thing to point out is that most of these, unless they have VM3 in the title, most of these are just based on, again, that one axis, so the horizontal axis. Which again, to be fair, tends to be the most relevant when we're talking about mobility. That's what we're looking for when we're talking about walking and running. But again, you just have to think about what potential data we're losing by focusing on just one axis. But for those that have the VM3, it does allow you to say cut points based on vector magnitude. But yeah, that's really only just two equations that are available to us. So the same limitations or kind of caveats apply, right? So as we get older, the heterogeneity cone just increases. We talked about chronic disease. We also need to talk about musculoskeletal limitations. So the threshold of activity is different for everyone. So one HIV patient is not the same as another HIV patient. So even simple tasks become incredibly, would actually be considered vigorous if we were to measure the VO2 and aerobic cost of those activities. So again, keeping that in mind, you just need to be mindful of that and include that in your publication. I mentioned you can create your own cut points, and so I wanted to just take a crack at doing that here so people can feel comfortable with how to do that. So if you go ahead and click Edit and scroll down to the bottom, you'll have this option of Add a new cut point set. And it gives you opportunity to name it. I don't think I need you pick a name. So you can call this Duke cut point. And I want you to try to create these 4 categories in the column on the right-hand side. So you're gonna have 4 cut points. And these are your thresholds. And we'll leave this up here just so I don't keep toggling back and forth, but if you need further instruction, please let me know. Anybody need those cut point thresholds again?
One more time.
Yep, no problem.
can't put the minimum in, I don't know why.
It automatically calculates that from the max, that's why.
Oh.
It just keeps using what you entered in before.
Oh.
Okay. So that's if we wanted to create our own. And then again, I always do cut points based on vector magnitude, using all of that data. And then save and close. And you'll see you now have that option as one of your drop-down algorithm choices. Okay. So again, we have some that are most commonly used. So again, keeping in mind what's your intention. Is your intention, do you want to be able to explain these in the context of population-based studies that have already been published? Then you want to use the Troiano 2008. That's what's been used before. That at least gives you some context. But I wouldn't stop there. I would then go into the next, which is the best practices using these updated algorithms that take into consideration more of the data. So that leaves us then with just two, which are one builds off of the other actually. So Friedson has 4 cut points. So she has light, moderate, vigorous, and very vigorous. Again, for most of my work, I'm really just interested in moderate plus, so I tend to collapse into just 2, maybe 3 categories. Ketel is the only one that has sedentary cut points, and her work is based on the Women's Health Study. So free living conditions versus Patty's, which is all laboratory based. So you can probably hear the bias in my voice, but I tend to err on the side of Ketel, using her vector magnitudes, because again, even though it's all women, it at least meets our benchmark for the setting that the activity is happening in, the age. And again, just remembering that all of these are going to underestimate the time that our folks are spending in moderate to vigorous activity. But it's better than self-report. And then again, as I mentioned, if you go back in here and look at some of these cut points, we do have some that are now starting to come out for disease populations. So you've got some work in Parkinson's disease. You've got, again, interesting work in children, different stuff in the Women's Health Study. So it behooves you to go into the literature, see what's available. But again, those aren't going to be populated by Actolife until there's a robust need for them. So it really is on you to try to find out what algorithm or cut points you want to use. So that's just a total sum of activity, right? So I want to know how many minutes per day on average do you spend in sedentary light moderate activity? Well, now maybe I want to know about the quality of that time. Is it sustained periods of time? How many times or how much time do you spend sitting for prolonged periods of time, in 10-minute chunks and 30-minute chunks? So you can also look at bouts of activity across all of those intensities as well. For that information, you need to specify what is a bout, so how long did that bout need to be? In the previous iteration of activity guidelines, they used to specify it has to be at least 10 minutes to count. And so you see a lot of work looking at 10-minute bouts of activity relative to activity bouts and health outcomes. And then you also then specify what is the minimum count during that bout. Okay, so 10 minutes of activity. I'm interested in looking at sedentariness. Well, what's my cut point for what sedentary is in terms of counts per minute? Is it 0 to 100, and anything that's outside of 100 is not sedentary? So those are all things we have to tell Actolife and define for the software. So I'm given an example here on the top where if we're saying, okay, we're interested in a 10-minute bout. So we have from 9:01 in the morning to 9:10 in the morning. That's our 10 minutes on the top. And we say the minimum count that I'm going to use to define moderate intensity activity is 1,953 each minute. That's my lower threshold for moderate intensity. The max count for what I think is realistic is not riding on the lawnmower is 50,000 counts. And then they have this term called spike tolerance, which is saying how many of those cells will you allow to be outside that window of 1953 and 50,000. and how many minutes apart do they have to be. So spike tolerance is the least tolerant of them all, saying I will not allow any of those cells to be outside of that scale of counts per minute. And so we'll only identify a bout of activity as 10 consecutive epochs of data with a minimum of 1953 and a max of 50,000. So if you look at this table here, this is an example of a valid bout. All of these activity counts per minute fall within that threshold. If you look down here, I flagged the one epoch where we have below the 1953. So this would then wipe out the entire bout. This would not be considered a bout of activity. So the 0 spike tolerance is really restrictive as a cautionary tale. Now, if I was interested to say, okay, I'm going to open up the window, I'm going to allow then, every 2 minutes or so, I'll allow, or within a bout of activity, I'll allow at least, or up to 2 cells that maybe fall outside of that bandwidth. And so looking at this new bout of activity, again, 10 minutes in length, same criteria, minimum of 1953, max of 50,000, how many cells fall outside of that range? 2. So that would actually be included. That would count as a valid bout of activity. Now if I change that, and again, then I add down here a third one where I've got a spike tolerance of 2, and then I've got this other one that seems to be outside. I should have added a 0 on that, sorry. But if you had 3 within that bout time of 2 minutes, this would be invalid, because I've got 1 too many cells that are outside the range. Does that make sense? So bouts in and of itself is a messy business as well. The other thing to keep in mind about when you define bouts is that even though you say I'm interested in 10-minute bouts, it doesn't just cut off the data at that point. It will actually keep looking, keep searching the data, counting this as an entire bout until it gets to the next point at which an epoch has violated your metrics. So this would actually count as a full 14-minute bout instead of 10, because it didn't stop until 6:14 where we had our third kind of discrepancy or error. Again, bouts are really interesting both for active and sedentary behavior, so you can do both. Actolife has a full section of analyses. I should provide, let's go back into bouts in the software. And this is where you can also define your new bouts. So if I wanted to do my 10-minute MVPA using those same criteria I had before, so a window of 10 minutes, use minimum of 1952. Not really going to specify maximum because I want anything over moderate intensity. Click accept. And again, this is the most generous drop time that we typically see in the literature. I rarely see people go over 2. And then you can run your bouts. So you can see the more and more of these outcomes that I click, the longer it takes to process. And this is only 11 files. So again, everything kind of comes at a cost and a trade-off. So sedentary analysis, as I mentioned, is a whole separate category also in terms of outputs, but it's a really booming area of interest for those of us working with older adults. So this is where I think accelerometry is particularly valuable because we know people are not very good at recounting how much time they spent in sedentary activities or light intensity activities. It's really hard, even for those of us who are activity inclined, to reliably estimate. So it's a really nice complement and addition to self-report. And again, as I mentioned before, we generally define sedentary as anywhere between 1 and 1.5 METs. And it's something while either sitting or lying down, but is not sleeping. So it is sedentary behavior. So the most common practice is to define it using, again, hip-worn monitors. And some work has been done showing that maybe a cut point of less than 100 counts per minute is reliably definitive of sedentary behavior. But it's kind of like that 10,000 steps per day folklore where there's not a lot of scientific evidence about 100 counts per minute. or 10,000 steps. So there's actually more work coming out about, again, coming up with some population-specific cut points for what defines sedentary behavior. So you get anywhere from 100, 150 to 200. So again, that needs a little bit of homework on your part to decide what I should be using. And again, there's actually some work coming out that maybe this is one of those scenarios where we really do just want to focus on one axis instead of all three. Because that vertical axis is what's telling us about movement and motion up and down in the plane, usually reflecting mobility, maybe absence or low thresholds, and that one vertical axis is really what's going to be informative for referring to sedentary behavior. So there are two algorithms for sedentary analysis. If you go ahead and click on the edit, excuse me, so that was for the cut points in the MVPA. And that is different than a sedentary analysis. So clicking on the Kedel cut point here that has a sedentary threshold is just going to tell you the amount of time spent in sedentary behavior. It's not going to give you much detail about that sedentary behavior. Versus if you come in here, you can specify, what do I want sedentary to be? How long do I want it to be? So this is where you can do bouts analysis of sedentary behavior if that's what you're into. You cannot do that anywhere else in the software. It has to be through a separate analysis. And so here I've just specified kind of what a sedentary would be. It'd be at least 10-minute bout and a minimum or a maximum of 99 counts per minute. Again, you can decide to do this, vector magnitude or not. This last option, ignore first sedentary break of each day, is a really valuable option to check if you do believe that you've had anyone in your sample wear your monitor for 24 hours. And you're not a sleep person and you're not going to pull that data out. So this basically tells the software that if your last active bout is 9 p.m. and your next active bout is 9:30 a.m. on the following day, it will not include any of that data that was collected in between the two, because it ignores everything before that first bout. So this is the safest way to remove kind of some of that spurious data if you're not interested or qualified to look at sleep behavior from accelerometry, which I think is a fair assumption for me. So yes, specify sedentary bouts and also sedentary breaks. So again, this idea of it's not just how much time we spend on a day sitting at our desk, but how prolonged are those periods, how much do we break it up. So that's all what you need to do in the sedentary analysis. I kind of talked about the sedentary analysis setup, but what I did not point out was that I cannot alter this. So it's all sedentary bout. You've got one try at this, and one screen. So, but it's all determined. It's all hand calculated or hand imputed as well, if that makes sense. That's all I'm going to say about sedentary, unless people really want to dive into it.
I just have one question.
Yes.
So if they're wearing it on the wrist, can you still use this or should you just not? Okay.
You can.
Okay.
Yep, you can use it. It should scale up. You'll have to make sure you click on the body placement when you download it,
Got it.
where it was worn,
Okay.
and it should scale for you. Yeah. All right, so I'm just repeating myself here about what I said about ignoring the last period of the first day, useful for removing sleep. Then I give an example here similar to the bouts of activity, the bouts of sedentary behavior. So if I say, okay, I specify again another 10-minute window, but here I have a drop time of 2 minutes and a max count of 99, this following would be considered a sedentary bout because I only have 2 areas where it falls outside the threshold and it's more than 2 minutes apart. So here the spike tolerance is more about time versus the other one it's more about quantity within that 10-minute window. Okay, so let's play with sedentary. If you guys will go into the software and create this sedentary bout criteria. So again, going in, clicking sedentary analysis and edit. And I want you to specify a 10-minute minimum time, a 2-minute drop time, a max count level of 200, use the vector magnitude, and ignore the first sedentary break of the day.
Can you explain the significance of the drop time again?
Yes, so
You
Drop
told me it
time.
should be never be more than 2, right? But it's,
well, that's for the
Okay.
spike tolerance for activity.
Okay.
For drop time, there's almost no literature out there about which one to choose for sedentary.
okay,
But the, people say you want less than 20% of the whole sedentary bout to be outside of the sedentary threshold. Otherwise, it probably should be an active bout versus
Okay.
a sedentary
Yeah.
bout. So that's what that is. All right, how does it look? Any questions on that? All right, click accept. And if we click calculate for our 12 files, and then if you go and choose any file you want, if you click on that, one of the detail boxes in the details column, you'll get this really detailed analysis of all of your outcomes. So you've got kcals per hour, you've got MET rate, sedentary bouts, breaks, active bouts, breaks, percent time spent in different activities intensities. They also break it out by MVPA, thinking about the guidelines. You've got it per axis, you've got it for vector magnitude, you've got total, you've got counts per minute, you've got vector magnitude, total counts per minute and average. You have steps per minute. You've got all this information available. And you can do this by individual, by day. You can do this by individual, by hour, and you could do it by individual, by minute, if you really wanted to get into
I
it.
didn't see where you clicked the details.
Sure, so any of these, after you do calculate, any of those. So this is not where I often export my data, except for when I'm working with Shane. And then I do it from here. And it's a bit tedious because this is the only place where you can download or export minute level data. And you have to click on that details button for every file. So that's one caveat that they're hopefully working on. More to the point, I'm clicking this export button here that does all of it. And Katie, this is where you would want
That's
to make
right.
sure that everything is
Got it.
checked here. Okay, so you can have as much details as you want. This is all the information you can get from your sedentary analysis. Again, I've highlighted most likely what people are come to me and are interested in and or poll for publication. So they want to know what's on average, how much time do they spend sitting for 10 minutes or longer? Of those bouts, how often are they broken up by different sedentary breaks? The daily average of sedentary breaks. So again, these are papers focused on sedentary behavior. It's rare that people are doing this in conjunction with activity, because as you can see, it's just such a rich data source in and of itself. The other thing I've highlighted here that is not available in the results, and I really almost always calculate at the analysis stage, is percent time spent in sedentary bouts. So total time is a little bit biased because again, it really varies by how long the patient wore it. So one person who wears it for 10 hours a day could have a max of 10 hours of sedentary behavior, and one person who wears it for 14 could have 14 hours. So really you want to do it as a percent of the day that they wore it and the time that they wore it. But this is calculated outside of the software. This has to be done in the analysis stage. So considerations, again, with cut points for sedentary analysis, we're not able to kind of take into those details that Juliessa was talking about, like, well, how much of those are postural shifts? What's happening during that sedentary time? We really don't have that much data unless you get into that inclinometer type of feature and do some of that specialized analysis. But it's a really great way to capture sedentary behavior. Any questions about those 5 outcomes? That's the meat. That's That's all you guys usually want to play with, right? So if you can just get comfortable with that, again, kind of get comfortable with the literature, reach out to folks. Those are the steps. The last step is exporting it for the integration with all your other data. My one, again, kind of cautionary tale here is that for all outcomes in the scoring grid, whether it's energy expenditure, kcals, active minutes, you do not care about the total time that these folks have spent in that bout, in that energy expenditure, because again, that's the skew issue. And that is a direct proportion to how much and how long they wore it. So you really want to get into these kind of per day, percent, something that's grounded to the individual's data that then standardizes it across patients so that we take the issue of volume out of the equation.